My name is Ron Eglash. I'm a professor of science and technology studies at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. My work is in ethnomathematics, so I focus on mostly simulations, computer simulations of African villages, Native American design, artifacts and crafts from indigenous and vernacular groups.
Okay. And here at the actual Congress, you're giving talks on that particular subject?
Yes, I am. So I'm demonstrating my software and talking about the experiences of working with both indigenous groups and children and contemporary urban settings, science centers, and so on.
Okay. Can you just give us give us a bit of an insight into the, from an African perspective, as far as villages, mathematics?
Sure. Well, I started this looking at aerial photographs of African villages, traditional African villages. When you fly over these things in an airplane, what you see are fractals. You see similar shapes at many different scales. So for example, if you have circular houses, they'll tend to be in a circle, and those circles will tend to be in a circle. So you have circles of circles of circles. If you have rectangular houses, you tend to have rectangles of rectangles of rectangles. So that's a geometry we associate with nature. A tree, for example, is a branch of a branch of a branch. Clouds are puffs of puffs, mountains are peaks within peaks. I hadn't experienced it before in cultural designs, only in natural designs. So I was really interested in what was going on, and I just assumed that this must be part of indigenous architecture everywhere in the world. So I started looking at aerial photographs of Native American architecture, Pacific Island architecture, but the only fractal ones I saw were in Africa. So that's when I realized, well, there's something about knowledge going on here. It's not just unconscious social dynamics that are producing these fractal patterns. So I got a Fulbright to travel around Africa for a year and just ask people why they were building and living in fractals. So once I got here and started interviewing people who actually created the architecture, I realized that not only was it not unconscious, but it was very formal. They actually had sort of algorithms for how the village would expand. There was a kind of emergent architecture, if you will. And it wasn't only in architecture, it was in textiles, sculptures, even things like fortune telling and divination.
So I might confuse myself as well as you with this question, but I mean, what they're going through is a conscious process. But just as Michelangelo said that David was in the rock,
yeah,
and he extruded out from it. Would you say that the maths is kind of inherent in this society?
I think inherent is a really interesting word to use. So I often ask my students to come up with some language for this. They use words like embedded, inherent. We talk about, for example, mathematical practices. So let me give you an example. There's a windscreen in the Sahel, so the area between sub-Saharan Africa and the desert, where they take rows of millet straw, and they have long rows at the bottom, and then smaller rows and smaller rows and smaller rows and smaller rows. So I interviewed one of the guys who makes these things, and I said, look, anywhere in the world you go, fences are absolutely Cartesian and linear and regular. You guys have a fractal fence. It's a fence that changes scale as you go up. What's going on? So he said, well, if I lived in the jungle, I would make it all with long rows, because the long rows are quick and they're cheap. Doesn't take much time, doesn't take much straw. He said, the problem with the long rows is that a strong wind can blow dust through there. He said, now the little rows on top are really tight. They hold out the wind and dust. But it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of straw. And he said, we know from experience that the farther up from the ground you go, the stronger the wind blows. So we put in whatever it takes for each level to keep the wind out. So here was a kind of cost-benefit analysis this guy had thought out, right? And I measured the lengths and plotted it in a log-log plot. And it turned out the scaling exponent for the lengths of the straw screen were the same as the relation of wind speed to height in the wind engineering handbook. So I thought, wow, here's a bunch of guys who have come up with mathematically correct solution, right? But they didn't do any calculations. So some folks have challenged me. They said, well, wait a minute, we're not going to call this mathematics unless these guys were proving theorems, right? So I asked some mathematicians, Western mathematicians, I said, how would you guys prove that this is the optimal design? I asked 3 of them, and all 3 gave me the same answer. They said, oh, I wouldn't prove it. I would just go to my software and I'd put in the equations, and I'd see where the graph peaks. And where the graph peaks, that's where the optimum is. So these guys aren't proving it either, right? Whether you do it on a computer screen or a straw screen, it makes no difference as long as you have the right answer. So you might think of the Western approach as happening at a very brief moment in time, and it's all about one person. And that African approach being a kind of collective intentionality that evolves over time to the right answer.
And do you think there's lessons that can be incorporated or imported into a Western culture?
Absolutely, absolutely. But of course, Western culture is discovering this on its own. So we now have a new discipline called complexity theory that deals with self-organization and emergent forms. We have new social institutions like Wikipedia that take advantage of a kind of bottom-up collective grassroots approach to developing knowledge. So it's not just these indigenous cultures that have discovered it, it's Western culture that's discovering it too. It's just that the indigenous ones got there first.
And the future, do you see yourself developing this further? Are there branches from this?
Sure, sure. Well, most of my work is in science and math education. So I work with children on helping them simulate these designs, and then using that as a set of tools they can do to create their own design. So you don't want to tell kids that your heritage is all in the past. You want to give them a sense that your heritage also lies in the future. So we work with Native American, Latino, African American, and African kids. We were in Ghana this summer and help these kids start with the traditional designs, but then use those mathematical principles and computational principles to come up with their own creativity, their own design. So education is an important part of it, but you can apply this to development as well. So for example, you can look at how grassroots collective organization can be empowered using cell phones and information technology. There's a graduate student here, Rupert Arbach at University of Cape Town, who's been looking at shanty towns and how instead of bulldozing the shanty town and imposing some kind of order from the outside, you can hand people the tools and infrastructure so they can build from the bottom up and develop their own kind of fractal emergent architecture. So I think there's a bright future for fractals.
Yeah, that's great.
Yes, my name is Ron Eglash, and you've been watching me on Invent Africa.
That's great. Thank you so much.